Our programs have been free for the past year while we've been online, but they won't be when we go back in person in the fall. And membership will bring you great discounts, but really much more importantly, membership helps us bring these great programs to our audience. So I encourage you to join. Tonight's speakers are incredibly knowledgeable, and you are in for a treat. I'm going to start by introducing them, and then I'm going to hand it over to our moderator. So tonight we have Nisa Leung, who is the managing partner of Qiming Venture Partners, and she's calling in from Beijing. We hope she won't have too many technical difficulties. Nisa has investments in many biotech companies and has been focusing on that sector for quite some time, since before it was cool. So she really knows a lot about this. Scott Moore is director of the Penn Global China Program and the author of an authoritative paper that was just recently published at Brookings Institution on the biotech industry and implications for US policy. Greg Scott is the founder of ChinaBio Group, which works with US, European, and APAC life science companies who are trying to set up partnerships and acquisitions and new technologies and funding in China. And he has been based in Shanghai for many years. And our moderator this evening, Xiaoqing Boynton, is as much an expert as the speakers. She is Senior Director for International Affairs at the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, and she worked on cross-border deals and biotech at Albright Stonebridge Group and worked on the health and biotech sector at CSIS before that. So we are going to take some questions at the end. So as you listen, please type in your questions into the Q&A. You'll see the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Type in the questions and we will try to get to them. And at this point, with no further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Xiaoqing Boynton. So, and I will see you again later. Thanks.
Thank you, Dinda, for that very kind introduction. First of all, let me just say how honored I am to be here this evening and sharing the panel with such a distinguished group of experts, industry executives, and leaders. I think that the topic is very exciting. We have a lot of interesting issues to cover. So really thanks for this opportunity and to the China Institute for hosting this. Dinda, you have asked me to keep the discussion very conversational. So I'm going to ask a series of questions to each and all of our panelists here and welcome your insights and your wisdom. But let me, before I do that, let me just make a few very high level observations. First of all, I think that this is a terrific timing for us to discuss China and biotech. Our industry, biotech industry, has played a very prominent role in the global response to COVID, really highlighting that biotech is its strategic importance globally. This is also a very interesting timing for U.S.-China relationship. For those of us who monitor the bilateral relationship, I think that it's not an exaggeration to say that the bilateral tension, the bilateral relationship is under quite a lot of stress, and the tension really has not been decreasing under the new administration in Washington, as many have previously hoped to improve. Despite all of this, companies, are navigating this new normal, and while many companies are navigating this very complex and new relationship, healthcare and biopharma companies and the sector in general have largely remained as a bright spot to some extent. That said, there are lots of risk factors. There's a lot of uncertainty in our sector as well. For one, biotech is seen as an area of strategic competition with China. in Washington. And at the same time, the Chinese government is also placing very significant political attention and funding to this sector, given its importance. I think that we're going to talk about some of this, but at a very high level, looking at the new 14th five-year plan, there is a very strong focus on biotech, from basic research, biotech research, to cutting edge innovation and R&D in cell and gene therapies and such. All of this to say that this sector is receiving heightened focus on both sides of the Pacific. And I think that we have a lot to discuss. So maybe I can turn to Scott and ask the first question, because I think it's important, Scott, if you can help frame this discussion with a look at the political issues around China's growing biotech sector. What are the issues? What are the key issues in terms of U.S.-China collaboration? And why does it matter that China is aiming to develop its biotech sector so rapidly? Scott.
Yeah, thanks so much, Xiaoqing, and thank you to the China Institute. And it's a real pleasure to be part of this discussion. I've learned a tremendous amount just from our kind of preliminary discussions among the panelists, so we're really looking forward to it. So I would say that just to kind of take a big picture view of our discussion tonight, I think the reason that it's so interesting and important to be looking at biotechnology, the related kind of issues, the bioeconomy, biomedical research, all of that sort of complex, is that I really and truly believe it's fast becoming one of the most significant and important issues in the U.S.-China relationship overall, and to some extent, even China's relationship with the world at large. And I think there are three big reasons why that's the case, why this area, this sector, this industry is increasing so much in importance. I think the first is just the commercial opportunity, which you'll hear more about from my fellow panelists in a minute. The second is that policy prioritization that Xiaoqing just talked about. And I mean, I think for those of us who follow China, you can sort of point to a very ambitious policy target for just about anything. But what distinguishes biotech, I think, is the extent to which both the private sector and subnational governments, provincial, municipal, et cetera, have really responded to the policy prioritization given to biotech. It's sort of the combination of, I think, the level of ambition that you see in the policy, and then just the response from lots of different actors and sectors and kind of segments of the economy and of China's sort of political and economic system. The third reason that I think it's so important, and here I'll just spend a few minutes kind of digging in a little bit, is that in here it's a little bit less kind of on the good news side of the equation. Biotech has become a new arena for competition and rivalry in the U.S.-China relationship, somewhat unfortunately. And I think there are at least four big issues to kind of track and keep in mind in that respect. The first of those has to do with alleged unfair trade and economic practices, both with respect to IP theft. Many of you will probably remember the allegations made by the U.S. government last fall about what appeared to be a concerted effort on the part of China-linked actors to gain access to sensitive vaccine design information. So it's sort of the IP theft issue writ large, as well as more kind of market access and preferential treatment practices in biotech. Of course, one of the most significant of those being the kind of rules and processes by which biologics and different therapeutics are given reimbursable status for China's national health insurance scheme. The second set of issues has to do with kind of human rights and sort of censorship surveillance issues, both within China as well as abroad. One of the issues, again, many of you may recall from just sort of being in the headlines, the allegations of improper biomedical data collection on particularly members of the Uyghur minority, that in some cases appears to have been aided in some respects by foreign firms and foreign suppliers. And then on the other hand, some reports and some concern that there appeared to be some systematic effort to collect sensitive biomedical information and personally identifiable medical data on foreign citizens, especially in the US. Third category, kind of bioethics, the most notable of those kind of issue in that set being the He Jiankui CRISPR baby scandal of 2018. But then also more recently, an op-ed that was penned by the former Director of National Intelligence under the last administration, John Radcliffe, back in November, in which he made this sort of very eyebrow-raising allegation that China, and in particular the Chinese military, was engaged in all sorts of very ethically problematic research on genetic enhancement. Lots of reasons, I think, to doubt those specific claims, but nonetheless, I think really put it on the radar, particularly for the sort of more conservative-leaning parts of the political spectrum in the U.S. And I suspect we haven't kind of heard the last of that sort of type of issue. And then fourth and finally, and kind of most, I think, front and center right now, is biosafety and biosecurity. And here, obviously, the big issue is the allegations of, or the sort of theory of an accidental release of the COVID-19 virus. So for all of those kind of issues and reasons, we've seen biotechnology, biomedical research, and the bioeconomy become this sort of new arena or new front in terms of tensions and rivalry and competition in the wider relationship. And again, I think that's somewhat unfortunate, and I think we can talk at some length about maybe ways to emphasize more of the cooperation end of the equation. But I think that is a reality that we have to keep in mind. The last thing I just wanted to touch on very briefly, and it has to do more with kind of getting at that, at how to sort of bolster cooperation. I do think this is a sector and an issue set where the private sector and non-state actors are particularly important. One thing that I think is really interesting and important about biotech is the extent to which it really is very difficult for governments to sort of wrap their heads around. And that's true of Beijing as well as Washington and other governments. Part of it's just the sheer pace of technological progress. Part of it is the nature of technologies like gene editing and tools like CRISPR that are just very democratic. And so I think when you think about kind of policy and regulation, inevitably you end up with a fairly large kind of responsibility falling on industry associations, falling on private sector firms themselves, and on individual scientists and researchers and practitioners in the field. So for all of those reasons, I think it's an arena in which these sort of non-state and sub-state actors are especially important. Not that governments are not important, but I think that's something that we should keep in mind. And one last point on that, we talked in one of our preliminary discussions about the very significant role that subnational governments do play in biotech financing, particularly on the R&D side and the policy support side in China. And that's something that is fairly kind of distinctive about, I think, China's approach to this sector and industry. So all to say, I think these types of discussions and the involvement of private sector actors is especially important in this sector and arena. So with that, happy to hand it over and look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Scott. That was excellent, and I think that this the framing you just did, I think, is very helpful because it's this is the reality that the industry on both sides are operating, and I think that I'd like to come back to you later in this discussion on some of the collaboration potential areas. So we'll come back to you. But you mentioned private sector, and I think that's a good segue to my next question, and I think this is for both Nisa and for Greg. That looking at kind of the investment side, we have seen a tremendous amount of investment flow into China's biotech sector in recent years. I think there's some data that some China's healthcare startup raised 29 plus billion last year, which is kind of a doubling the number in 2019, which is very impressive. And I think that, you know, without a doubt, there is a lot of excitement about China's biotech industry and the potential opportunities. Nisa, maybe I can turn to you first and then to Greg, just for you to share some thoughts on kind of the opportunities on the investment side that you're seeing.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Xiaoqing, and thanks, Linda, for inviting me. Actually, you know, it's really interesting when it comes to numbers in China. I mean, what we see on the ground is the China sector only really raised 21 billion, which is, you know, still quite a bit more. It's 20% increase from 2019. And I think, you know, one of the reasons we find is that, you know, it may also be driven by inflation, but the deal number actually decreased from 980 to 830. So there are probably, you know, some companies sort of, you know, raising some larger pre-IPO rounds before they go public. And you know, even though we were in COVID, you know, we also saw that the healthcare sector, you know, IPOs have been quite active in the US as well as in China. So, you know, but, you know, we did have a gap of, you know, a few months where nothing was happening in China. And, but, you know, I think one of the reasons why healthcare became so hot in the last year is, you know, all around the world, it's really of COVID. You know, we also see TMT, you know, funds saying, okay, it's really hard to invest in TMT now because a lot of the big companies have, you know, gone public, a lot of the big opportunities. And so, you know, they're like, okay, well, since COVID is around and this looks like a really interesting field, we should try to invest in healthcare. So that's why, you know, we saw an influx of, you know, general funds, people who've never invested in healthcare, coming wanting to invest in the sector, and then just raising the valuation up by, you know, quite a bit. So I think there's somewhat of a bubble going on. I mean, I was doing a media interview yesterday, and you know, I think in general people feel that all around, and in fact, some of the the public companies listed in Hong Kong or Starboard, there's quite a bit of you know, bubble as well. We feel, you know, when talking to public investors and whatnot. So, you know, it would be nice to sort of slow down a bit, because we've seen, having been involved in this sector for over 15 years, we've seen, you know, cycles of, you know, the heights and downs and whatnot. I mean, even, you know, when we're looking at some reports on Zoom, how Zoom increased their traffic flow so much in the last year, but it's actually, the growth has actually come down in the last quarter or so. So, you know, we do hope that as an investor in this sector, it's nice to see more money coming in, but, you know, we are forecasting that the valuation is going to come down, the interest in this sector is going to come down. And so quite a few companies going forward in the next year or two is going to have a hard time fundraising in China.
Thank you. That's very interesting. And Greg, can I turn to you for your thoughts?
Sure. And Nisa and I have been on several panels together over the years and generally are in sync on our views here. But to call out maybe a couple of things in a little bit more detail. So Nisa mentioned that things were slowing to some extent, and I've learned I am absolutely no good at predicting the future. So I tend to look at what's happened in the past. And so she mentioned the new VC funds that are being raised. And actually 2019 was a little bit of a dip. And I know, Nisa, when we were on the panel at the beginning of 2020 during JP Morgan, that that was really, the reason for that was ascribed to a decrease in renminbi funds, but the US dollar funds seem to be moving on. And now what we've seen this year is a little bit of a catch up, which is kind of surprising given the COVID situation that obviously everybody's aware of. We fully expected this year to be a down year, but in fact, in terms of new VC funds raised, it actually set a new record. There were over $56 billion in new VC funds raised, either focused on China life science or in China focused on ex-China life science. So that was a huge increase over 2 years ago, the last up year, which was $43 billion. So there's a lot of money running around is kind of the bottom line. So to Nisa's point about there being a bubble, I think there's just there's too much money and not enough good deals, if you will. And so we're seeing a little bit of a frenzy. I think the title of this panel is very good. Frenzy, I think, describes it really well. And so far this year, that seems to be continuing. We're still seeing a lot of investments. We're seeing a lot of new funds being raised, funds that are, billion-dollar funds, which again, a few years ago, you wouldn't have heard of. And in fact, the first year I was in China, I think the total VC investment in life science was $300 million. I mean, hardly even a drop in the bucket. And now very often the Series A, Series B deals are 300 million plus. So it's a phenomenal time to be certainly an entrepreneur, and I think to some extent to be an investor in China. But there are, as Scott mentioned, some headwinds that everybody is dealing with. But I think China overall, and we'll probably deal with this a little bit later, has changed a lot of their policies that really make China an attractive place to do novel drug development.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Nisa, for kind of an update on what's going on today. Let's look at China a little bit, kind of more an in-depth level. So, China has this very massive drive to promote innovation, and we're seeing this in the new 5-year plan. And innovation really is the focus. What I'm seeing is that this innovation drive also appears to be very closely associated with the government's push for self-reliance, especially in key industries, including biotech. How will this effort impact the biosector in China, and how will it impact the prospect for global collaboration? Scott, maybe I'll turn this to you to hear your thoughts on this.
Sure, and I think it is a really it's a great question and a very important one, because I do think in sort of China's economic policy generally, and biotech in particular, you do see a bit of a tension and sort of almost like an internal struggle between, I think, these sort of impulses to liberalize and to sort of structure regulations and policies so as to welcome and leverage the inflow of foreign capital and investment and ideas and talent, combined with this sort of opposite instinct, which is pretty deeply rooted, I think, in Chinese political history, at least since 1949, of this kind of real desire for self-reliance and indigenous innovation, and not relying or needing to rely on sources of investment or talent or ideas from abroad. And I think that kind of struggle and that contradiction is not a bad way to think of China's economic policy and China's biotech policy kind of writ large. So I think you do see some genuine attempts at liberalization and policies that intend to welcome those sort of foreign influences, so to speak. But then I think you do see also this sort of opposite reaction, and I think that is clearly reflective, at least to me, of a constituency and a sort of school of thought among Chinese policymakers that the goal, really should be to kind of indigenize and create this sort of more autarkic economic system. And then the last point I would make in response to your question, Xiaoqing, is I think it does kind of go back to the competition dimension or competition sort of issues in this space, which I think unfortunately we can't ignore. And so I think when you have this sort of strand in biotech policy and sort of bioeconomy policy, it definitely gives kind of fear and concern among U.S. policymakers something real to latch on to. And I think a lot of what we're seeing is that kind of tension between wanting to kind of chase this commercial opportunity in the sector, but also realizing that there is still very much an asymmetry. As dramatic as the growth of China's biotech sector has been, it is behind in most substantive respects. to the US and other developed markets. So, you sort of, again, from in this kind of competitive framework that US policymakers are kind of boxed into, unfortunately, when it comes to China, you sort of look at that and you say, well, are we not kind of losing more than we're gaining from this relationship? And I think that's the political risk that exists for this space, as well as other technology areas in the U.S.-China relationship. So certainly, I hope that we'll be able to kind of mitigate that and approach things in a constructive way. But I think just from a sort of policy perspective, that's a bit the mental box that people are in at the moment.
That's really a great kind of description of how to kind of approach this issue. And I just to add to that point that I think in many areas of biopharma, multinational companies are bringing much needed innovative therapies, solutions, and technologies to Chinese patients. And I think that through some of them are through partnership with the Chinese-based companies. Some of them are through direct investment. And I think those are kind of what really have been constituting as kind of the bright spot in this type of cross-border activities and bilateral commercial relationships. And Greg, I actually want to turn to you for the next question. I know that in addition to your leadership role of ChinaBio Group, you are also wearing another hat as AmCham in Shanghai, the chair of AmCham's healthcare committee. And so I wanted to kind of switch in your head a little bit and then get a little bit of a closer look at the multinational companies and their, kind of their presence in China. So, we talked about this fast-growing biotech sector in China. We talked about the government's focus and pledge to support the domestic innovation and the sector. What are the opportunities and challenges that you're seeing still exist for foreign companies in China? What if you can give us a flavor of the type of projects that are underway, that are going well, that are successful, but what are the key policy barriers for multinational companies in the China market today?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, Scott, you did a pretty good framing of that with sort of the yin and yang. You've got the good and the bad, if you will. So you've got the government who's creating a lot of very good policies that are very productive for multinational companies or even small companies that want to bring their drugs or devices to China. So in August 2015, China announced a major sea change in their government policies for accepting drugs and devices into China, and that they would start accepting foreign data and so on. I know we happened to have a conference right around that time, and we sort of all said, oh yeah, okay, well, this is great, but what's it really going to look like? And it's been pretty phenomenal in the 5 years following that China did completely change the regulations. They are basically joined the ICH. They accept global trials now. You can do a phase 1 trial in China. There's actually been the first drug, I think, that's been approved for the global market first in China. I think it's a BMS drug. So it's been a huge change, and that's made life much easier for the multinational companies to do business and bring their products into China. Now, on the flip side of that, China giveth and China take away. You've got the reimbursement and the payment scheme. So I know in our healthcare committee, our executive committee, where we explore issues, one of the major issues that used to be the regulatory issue and getting things approved, that's now mitigated. And now everyone's worried about volume-based pricing. That it's even if they get their drug into China, and when they do, they don't know what they'll be able to charge for it. And China is saying we want things to be absolutely as cheap as possible. And so sort of the dichotomy is it's much easier to get things into China, but now in some regard, it's harder to make money at them. And so one of our AmCham members is focused on implantable stents. and they're virtually abandoning that business in China. They reduced their staff by 2/3, and they're just going to basically turn it over to the China competitors, if you will, because they could no longer meet the prices that the China government was demanding. So I think there are certainly some challenges there. But on the other hand, if you have a drug or a device that's desperately needed, China even created the urgently needed list of drugs a couple of years ago, 48 drugs that they wanted to bring into China as quickly as possible. And I think quite a number of those now have been approved in China. They really are trying to get multinational companies and foreign companies to bring their products to China.
And Greg, would you say that, there is a certain focus on some of the kind of on the urgent list, a focus on oncology, on some of the more advanced therapies, again, kind of back to the theme that we have talked about, kind of areas where innovative companies that are still bringing a lot of value add to the market. Is that a fair assessment?
Oh, absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. Oncology has been the #1 indication in China, both in terms of investment and partnering and development activity for as long as we've been tracking the data. And I expect that will continue. Obviously, oncology cancer is a significant issue in China, and they're really trying to address that. If you look back 10 years ago, I think of the top 10 cancer drugs at that time, there were only 3 that had been approved in China. And now I think it's probably 7 or 8 of the top cancer drugs are now available in China. So that's one reason they created this urgently needed drug list, to try and meet the need of their patients. China's very conscientious about trying to keep their population healthy. They're basically the world's largest HMO. They provide virtually all of the healthcare services in China, with the exception of some of the independent insurance companies. And they want to keep their population healthy and happy. I mean, that keeps them in office, right? So, so it's very important to them.
Just following the theme of this dichotomy. So a question that comes up often these days is, how innovative is China's emerging biotech, biopharma sector? How do they compare with the kind of global players? And I think I'm curious to hear from all of you on this question of, how innovative are these Chinese companies, and specifically kind of looking at some of the cross-border transactions for Chinese-based companies. I think that, we have read in the news that there are some major licensing deals that the companies are pursuing. Some are pursuing, kind of product co-development partnerships with some of the larger global players. What are the opportunities and challenges that you are seeing for these China-based companies in today's geopolitical environment? I know this is a very big question. Take it, in any way that you'd like. Nisa, maybe I can start with you, and then Greg, and then Scott.
Yeah, sure. I actually like to put us into a framework first. I think, when I came back from California to start my first healthcare company in China, I remember going to the, and that was back in 2002, 2003. When I went to the largest medical equipment conference exhibition in China, there were probably about 300 companies exhibiting. 99.9% of the companies were exhibiting black and white ultrasound machines and patient monitoring system. That's it. I mean, they had nothing. And I remember, and now, of course, every year they start, having some little products here and there and whatnot, some improvements. But it's good to see that there are more and more new products. But still, we're still trying to catch up with what's happening in the US, right? But at the same time, I also remember back in SARS days, and that was around SARS days, China actually did not have the ability to even develop its own diagnostic test to see whether or not it's SARS, let alone drugs, vaccines, services and things like that. And dialing back to today, it's really good to see that companies are at least able to do that. I mean, we have about 50, 60 of our portfolio companies, helping out on the Wuhan side, be it on, developing vaccine, on the drug side, even traditional Chinese medicine to treat patients in Wuhan. and ventilators and internet hospitals and things like that. So it's really good to see that advancement. But one of the things that I was in the last couple of weeks, I've also been talking to folks in Beijing University, Tsinghua, professors and whatnot. And in reality, we're still 20 years behind US when it comes to innovation. I think one of the things I still remember also when I came back to China back in those days, India is actually way advanced than China. I mean, I didn't think that China had a chance to even be the second largest market in the world. But I think it was really one issue, one thing that happened that made China had a chance. And that was, I believe, the Indian court decided to rule to nullify Pfizer's patent and allow an Indian generic company to win. And because they wanted to promote the generic sector in India. And at that time, a lot of the big pharma MNCs, basically, they were planning to do the R&D center in India. They all decided to pull out and set up the R&D center in China. And that's when China really flipped and had the opportunity to be one of the major centers in the sector. And I think given the experience that we had, China really tries to uphold the patent, at least in the healthcare sector. I can't talk about other sectors. I don't know the other sectors well. And in fact, from our investment, I always say to our portfolio companies, you need to develop your own patent. We cannot infringe on anybody else's patents. It's very, very important for us to continue to grow. Now, of course, there are always bad elements in the sector, people who want to try to make big, fast money. But this is something that we uphold, which is very, very important. And I think it's also interesting to see, and I applaud, companies doing that. In fact, Medtronic recently started filing patent lawsuit against some of the Chinese companies in stents, well, not in stents, but in neuro products and so forth. And we actually, I told the Medtronic head, I said, you guys should do more of that because, we really don't want to see, even when we're trying to develop the Chinese ecosystem, we really don't want to see Chinese companies infringing on other people's patents. This is not the right way to develop ourselves. And so, and I think one of the things that I also want to mention is when you guys were talking about, really overtaking and this and that, but I think right now we're still trying to meet the minimum ability to serve the healthcare, the population in basic healthcare. Now, one of the reasons why I invested in CanSino, it's not because of the Ebola vaccine, nor is because of the COVID vaccine. They didn't even have a COVID vaccine. But 6 years ago, I felt that, we had so many issues with children vaccine, and every country's CDC needs to have a children vaccine, program. But in China, people just cannot afford the imported vaccines. They're very, very expensive. It's like $300-400 US for one shot. There's no way they can afford it. And then the domestic product, the quality is just so bad. So, what does the CDC do? I mean, they have to impose something. So, I just felt that, since CanSino has a really, it's a group of scientists, they really want to do their children grown up, and they say, okay, why don't we just try to build a company developing quality children vaccine for China? And so I invested in it. And so, same thing for Internet Hospital. Why did we invest in Internet Hospital 5-6 years ago? We didn't have COVID back then. It's really because through the years, we've been looking at, all these people in the rural areas, they just can't get access to good healthcare. So, and I think China tried really hard, and their private companies try really hard to train the doctors in the villages, like really remote villages. But when you can teach GP, but you can't teach specialty. So how do we reach out to them so that they don't need to hike, hours or 9-10 hours to the nearest hospital to get, services? So we thought, okay, why don't we invest in a company that can reach out to them? And that's Internet Hospital. And that's why, during COVID, these companies really helped out, with providing diagnosis and treatment for people. So it's really from providing basic services to the people who are in need, which actually is so, it's already abundant in US and a lot of other countries, but it's just not available here in China. So same thing as, I just recently did a deal in women's health. For the last few years, I just felt that globally, women's health is so ignored. Everybody puts so much money into cancer, but all the fibroid issue, endometriosis issue, why do women need to go through all these surgeries and then also have fertility issues because of something that's so simple that maybe we can solve? So, we did a very thorough analysis and felt that, okay, we need to fund this area. And so we did. So I think, this is something that we just continue to do, providing basic healthcare services to people who don't right now have any availability at all. So, but, when it comes to innovation and, competition through the world, I think our main focus is really still serving the needed right now in China, and maybe even some of the needed in, really poor countries. And that's our investment thesis.
That's very helpful. And I think that when we look at the sector, this is a sector that is so closely associated with people's well-being, and, which is a key priority for any government, in China included. And I think that, Nisa, the picture you just painted is that China also has a very significant job to do in terms of providing this basic universal healthcare and meeting the basic public health standard. And I think that the industry overall, domestic and global, has been making significant contribution to it. And I think this is, and thank you for highlighting that very unique and important role. Greg, I'd like to turn to you and see if you are okay with commenting kind of on this question from kind of the cross-border angle. Specifically, like to hear your thoughts on what are some of the more innovative China-based companies, if you're seeing any, and what they're doing kind of globally, and any interesting trends or new development that you're noticing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a perfect question. And actually, that's what I was figuring on following up with Nisa as well. Of course, she puts her money where her mouth is, where I just track the data mostly, what's going on. But we are seeing more multi-billion-dollar deals, billion-dollar plus deals coming out of China, where they're out-licensing their assets to Western companies. So that's been a major shift over the last 3, maybe 4 years. I guess the first deal of that category was probably Innovate, which is a Suzhou-based company, which was focused originally on doing biosimilars, which are biologic drugs that are, as the name implies, similar or like generic to other drugs. But they shifted to doing novel drugs. And the first deal was with Eli Lilly, I think around the 2013, 2014 timeframe. It was for 9 assets and it was $1 billion. Now we're seeing single asset deals. When I say asset, I mean like a drug or a device, but typically a drug. We are seeing single asset deals being done for $1 billion plus. Innovate did another deal with Roche. It was $2 or $3 billion plus. Innovate did a follow-on deal with Eli Lilly for another $1 billion. And of course, Innovate isn't the only company doing these things, but I point them out because they seem to have a run on the large deals. And I mentioned earlier that the companies are raising significant amounts of venture capital. And many of those are in licensing Western assets and then developing them. So talking about the partnership kind of thing going the other way. So as well as novel drugs going outside of China, you have novel drugs coming into China and being developed for the China market by Chinese companies, sometimes for the global market. So Zai Lab in Beijing, for example, have both in-licensed drugs from Western companies and are developing them for the global market in China because they feel they can be more efficient about that and then take them to the global market. So those are just a few of the companies. And Nisa mentioned CanSino, which is founded actually by a good friend of mine, one of the founders, Don Chu, who was the very first person I met in the industry in China when I went there on vacation in November 2006. So, so it's great to see Don being successful and his team being successful with CanSino. But yeah, there's a lot of innovation coming out of China. There's more CAR T trials being done in China than anywhere else in the world, for example, even more than in the US. They obviously are very focused on things like CRISPR. So they're very good at taking interesting technologies, novel technologies, and doing things very quickly and moving them forward very quickly.
Thank you. I think that's very interesting, and I think kind of just to put a more simplified answer to the question, how innovative is China's biotech company? I think that what we're hearing from you, Greg, is that there are some very innovative China-based companies, and that are developing for the world, and I think that's very exciting, and certainly a somewhat emerging trend that I think that it's very important to keep an eye on.
That's very true. And if I could just add one more thing to kind of tie back to Nisa, there are areas there where China is really very far behind. I think medical devices is one. I think medical devices lagging significantly behind the drug area, but the drug area, they're definitely catching up, and in some areas even ahead maybe of other parts of the world. So,
thank you for that. And Scott, if I can turn to you on this question a bit, and looking at kind of the geopolitical environment that you mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, are you seeing any specific opportunities and challenges for this kind of global partnerships with China, the type of partnerships that China-based companies are pursuing under today's environment? If you have any comments, I'd love to hear that as well.
Yeah, no, thank you, Xiaoqing, because I regretted a little bit not kind of being a little bit more optimistic in my response to your last question. But and let me kind of start with something that Greg said, and it certainly follows from what Nisa said as well. Sort of 5 to 10 years ago, there was this kind of absurd debate, even among some academics, of effectively, can China innovate? I mean, there were literally papers written about that, and it's pretty clear that the answer is yes, in a lot of respects, including in biotechnology. But the kind of geopolitical or sort of international implication of that innovation capacity is that China is already and will continue to be one of the big and sort of indispensable actors in all issues related to biotechnology, of which there will be many in the international relations and security and geopolitical and military worlds over the next couple of decades. And I think you especially see this with respect to gene editing, where unfortunately it's pretty much assured that we will see rising kind of levels of threat from the use of gene editing to create new types of weapons, probably will dramatically increase the risk of bioterrorism on one hand, so really create very serious but also shared security threats. And the fact that gene editing in particular is such a democratic technology, that it is relatively easy to use and deploy, means that all major powers, I think including China as well as the US and others, have a shared interest in trying to do something to help kind of regulate the use of this technology and the availability of potentially really dangerous forms of genetic material. On the other hand, biotechnology, and again, especially gene editing, it opens up all kinds of really astonishingly promising ways to improve the human condition. And it's everything from the treatment of diseases to potentially being able to modify bacteria to speed up carbon sequestration, so that we could hopefully be able to do a little bit more to stop climate change. I mean, we're just on the cusp of all of these incredible sort of possibilities, but China's going to be right in the center of all of that. Both the risks and the opportunities and the rewards. And so we certainly have to, at some level, figure out how to develop a constructive relationship and framework in biotechnology as well as other areas. And again, though, I would say one thing that I've been thinking a lot about is just the importance of private companies and the sort of non-state sector in general in doing that for some of the reasons that I talked about earlier. And the last quick thing I'll say is I think it just deserves to be underscored that the reality of most technologies, including and maybe especially biotechnology, is that while there are sort of certain ways in which you kind of have competition, both geopolitical and commercial, a lot of it really is co-production. That there are gains to both sides, and I think drug trials are a potentially interesting example of that, of where the kind of particularly in certain early phases of drug trials, it can be advantageous to test drugs in the Chinese market just for regulatory and sort of logistical reasons. That makes it cheaper and easier, and potentially provides a stronger evidence base for certification, both in China and the US and other markets. So, the reality again is that there are a lot of opportunities and benefits that kind of flow from cooperation and collaboration in different arenas. So as much as I've talked about competition, I think it's definitely important to also underscore the benefits of constructive collaboration.
That was excellent. And I think that you really kind of highlighted the unique nature of this sector, that, it's really relies so heavily on international collaboration, on science, on R&D, and, some of the global trials are not only important, but a necessity in terms of, getting the drug to approval to patients. So I really appreciate that point, which I think is a very important one. Dinda, I see you raising your hand. So I think that's a hint that we were running.
No, it's perfect. It's absolutely, you guys are amazing, by the way. You are just perfectly on the clock. So we have just one question which has come in from the audience, but and I'd like to ask that, but I first want to ask one other question before turning it back to you, Xiaoqing. But I wonder if you all could talk a little bit, just briefly, about whether you're concerned about the pressures on on scientific collaboration. Just that scientists in America, Chinese scientists in America, have come under tremendous pressure in the last year or two, and I just wonder if you guys have any thoughts about how important you see that kind of collaboration as being, et cetera. So let's first ask that quick question, then there's one from the audience, and then I'll let you guys finish it up. That's for anybody to jump in. Scott, I think probably you'll jump in first, right?
Well, yeah. So sorry, certainly not to monopolize things, but I do kind of think about that a lot, just in my with my kind of university administrator hat on, and I think the risk is very real. But I think the impact, at least that I have seen directly, has actually not been huge, and I attribute that mostly to the value again of co-production, and I think to the many just personal ties that a lot of people in the biomedical field have between the U.S. and China. One thing I would say, though, that is much more worrying is in the broader kind of community of people who work on China, and this includes like social scientists as well, but there is increasing fear of physically traveling to China and being detained or being kind of surveilled or otherwise targeted, and so I think they're
by the Chinese government,
by the PRC. I mean, I'm sure there are similar fears, among Chinese researchers, but here I'm referring to U.S.-based researchers of China, and so the knock-on implications of that, if we really do see a fall off in-person sort of travel and interaction, could be really really bad. But we'll sort of know more once people start traveling, hopefully in the fall.
And Nisa and Greg, just quickly, do you guys, what do you think about the importance of scientific collaboration? And do you see it as a positive, or do you think there are risks? What do you see?
Well, maybe I can start first. So I'm actually catching up with the China head of J&J, Roche, and AstraZeneca separately next week. And I, our work really is to help, create and build more collaboration among all parties. Because for us, the end result is really whatever is beneficial to the patients, right? So, so I think that by having more collaboration, it's actually good for all parties. I've been meeting. I went through a 14-day quarantine from Hong Kong to get to China. It's okay. I think a lot of my friends have all gone through quarantine somewhere. But the good thing is I was able to rent a treadmill so I could run in the hotel room every day. But I think what's really interesting, having seen quite a few researchers on my trip, even this time from the US and others, everybody also has the same viewpoint that they would like to see more collaboration, right, between US and China. Because I think for the scientists, their ultimate goal is really to develop drugs that work, that can serve the general good. So, so I think by collaborating, it will just only help, not only for people, in the two countries, but, just globally. So that's what we'll continue to do. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's been pretty well covered by Scott and Nisa here, but I'll just amplify maybe something that Nisa said. And she mentioned J&J. Well, they opened their innovation hub in Shanghai, about 4 or 5 years ago, I think now. It seems like it was only yesterday. But basically all of the major multinational pharmas have followed suit, or several of them have. So you've got Merck just opened fairly recently. Roche has announced theirs. It's going to open, I think, next year. You've got Boehringer Ingelheim there. So I think the major multinational pharmas recognize that cross-border collaboration is immensely important. And those incubators, by the way, are not only for Chinese companies, they're for Western companies that want to come to China and do work in China and collaborate with the Chinese. So I think that the people in the industry really believe that collaboration is the right way to go and are trying to foster that as best they can.
Right. So there's one question here from the audience, and so I'm going to ask that, and then I'll turn it back to Xiaoqing to sort of wrap things up. But so there's one question, which is that China was planning to institute a patent term extension. I hope this isn't too kind of in the weeds, but a patent term extension law like Hatch-Waxman a few years ago. It looks like that effort stalled. What are the prospects of a patent term extension law being passed in China in the near future? Anybody want to take that?
Well, I'll take kind of a stab at it. Maybe Nisa or Scott know more than I do, but we did a deal last year that basically was dependent on this very thing, that there was a Waxman-Hatch exclusivity that would be provided to the drug that the Western company was bringing to China, because there was no specific IP in China, but it would be the first drug for a significant unmet need, in this case, social anxiety disease in China. And the deal was done on that basis. And my understanding is that, in fact, that has gone through and that they will receive 6 years of exclusivity because of that. So I think it's in place, but I wouldn't stake my reputation on it necessarily.
And I would just add that yesterday, June 1st, was actually the day when China's amended patent law went into effect. And a little bit of background is that a lot of the amendments for this legislation has direct connections to patent term extension and the Hatch-Waxman like patent linkage system in China, and these issues are actually one of the priority issues under the U.S.-China Phase 1 trade agreement, and it's something that the U.S. government and Chinese counterparts have discussed quite a lot. So I think there's actually some very positive development on the legislative side, but like all issues in China, I think really the question is implementation. Now we have this very important legislation going into effect. I think the question for all of us to look at is how this will be implemented. What kind of supporting regulations will come out that really support the implementation? So I'm just kind of wanted to add this update here.
Xiaoqing, did you want to, ask a final question, and then we'll wrap up for the evening?
I know, we're already run over time. So I wanted just to invite each of the speakers to just maybe, of a closing, kind of a final message for the audience, maybe just 1 or 2 sentences kind of on, the call. I think maybe even just on the collaboration, what are you seeing, or what kind of message you'd like to highlight for the audience.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe I'll start, and I'll leave it to the others to
Sure.
add more insights than I probably will. But I think, as you said, collaboration is really a key here. So when we're working with our clients who are interested in coming to China, we generally recommend that they work with a Chinese company to bring their products to China. It's much easier if you have someone who's already in the market, familiar with the market. That can help you do that. And in fact, we're just launching next week a major study for a big multinational medical device company that already has a significant presence in China, but they want to not only bring new products to China, they want to increase their sales in China. One thing that we'll be looking at them very carefully is, are there partners that they could use in China that would help accelerate their sales in China?
Nisa, maybe we can turn to you.
Yeah, I think that, I would love to see more and more US and European companies and Japanese companies expanding themselves in China, because there are a lot of drugs still not available in China. And I think historically, primarily only generic drugs are available, and the generic drugs have been, priced at a very high price, innovative price. So I think it's really good to see that the medical reimbursement is bringing down the cost of the medicine, so it becomes more affordable to people. But at the same time, when we talk to doctors, there's still a lot of devices and drugs that are not available in China right now that are already available everywhere else. So it would be great to see all these overseas companies coming into China to offer and expand the sales here.
Thank you, Nisa. That was great. Scott, final message from you.
Sure. I think my final message would be around the importance of data in particular, for 2 reasons. One, I think some of the, at least in the kind of short term, some of the most powerful kind of applications are actually at the intersection of biotechnology and AI. For example, but there are special difficulties with coding biomedical data in a useful way for those types of applications. And then kind of on the flip side, China does have some kind of unusually restrictive policies when it comes to data sharing in general, but especially biomedical data. There are some good reasons for that. China's not alone in that. There are other countries that are even more restrictive, but just because of the size and scale of China's biotech sector, that has been something that's been of increasing concern abroad from both an economic competitiveness point of view and a sort of geopolitical point of view. And so I think kind of going forward, if there was kind of one segment of all this that I would say it's important to focus on, it's data.
Thank you. This really is terrific. I have learned a lot from this discussion, and I know that there are so many other topics that we could cover if we given more time. But Linda, I'm going to turn it over to you.
So I just want to thank you all so much. I mean, this has been not only such a sort of informative deep dive into, what's going on in China, et cetera, but also most importantly, such a reasoned and rational discussion, which is so much needed right now. And finally, I just want to say that I was really moved by Nisa's description of some of the investments that you're making. And let's all remember that, you really wonderfully humanized the conversation by reminding us that, you're investing in companies that are investing in children's vaccines, and an internet hospital that is helping deal with the COVID crisis and this kind of thing. So I just, if there's one thing that China Institute wants to do in terms of promoting understanding, it's kind of humanizing all of these conversations so that we, can step away from the extreme politicization of everything. And I just want to thank you all so much. Xiaoqing, you're a brilliant moderator, and you are all so smart and so well informed. So thank you very, very much. And to our audience, please come again. We have these conversations all the time, and I hope you'll join us once again. We want to bring you all four of you back to our stage, hopefully in person next time. But thank you so, so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Take care.